And so this brings me to the natural next question for me is what incompatibility did you experience, if any, with your view of science and your view of faith? Were they separate things? Were they always compatible in your mind? Did you struggle with that at some point?
That's a great question, and I've got kind of a complicated answer to that because in a very practical sense, I'm looking here at my dad, who to this day is arguably the most respected person of myself on this planet. He's a Christian. He's a scientist. I mean, I had to have just looked at that and intuitively say, okay, that's got to work together somehow because here's this most respected person in my life. He's a strong Christian and a scientist. So as a practical measure, I knew it's like, okay, this has got to work somehow. Where I started encountering what people would perceive as a conflict is as I went away to college that I took what I learned during the summer, started reading, continued to read my Bible regularly. And I think it was my sophomore year of college, I started reading through Genesis. And as I'm reading through Genesis, I'm reading my study Bible there. I'm reading the passage to see what it has to say. But I like this Bible because it had little notes down. You could look at the star and go down and look at the notes and see what it said about that particular verse. And as I was reading Genesis, the notes in there said, the short answer, Jeff Zweerink's paraphrase of the notes was, these have to be 24-hour days. That means the earth is a few thousand years old. And so I'm looking at that saying two things. One, if that's what Scripture says, then that's where I'm going to live. I mean, there's no place in there where I thought, well, I kind of don't like that. I'm going to have to see how to reinterpret that. No, I really did believe if the Bible is God's revelation to humanity, that God inspired the biblical authors to write what they did, then what it says I'm taking that seriously. It's got authority in my life. I don't get to weigh in on whether I like it and change it. What it says is what it says, and I need to adjust to that. But, I'm also a scientist, and it's like, okay, I'm learning in my classes, nothing explicit, but, know enough of the science to know that Bible talks about, or science talks about the universe being billions of years old. The earth is billions of years old. And so I'm like, what do I do with that? And in my thinking, I'm figuring, okay, there was an intuitive idea I had that I couldn't articulate till later. But it's this idea that God has revealed himself in scriptures. I'm convinced of that. Scriptures tell us that God's revealed himself in creation. And so as we study creation, God's two revelations have to agree with one another. And so, but here I am wrestling. It's like one revelation seems to say the earth is young. The other revelation seems to say the earth is old. What do I do with that? My original thought was, well, maybe scientists just don't understand time well. Maybe it's not linear. Maybe it's logarithmic, or it's exponential. And so what we see is what was actually a few thousand years based on our measurements looks like billions of years. I had just kind of wrestling with that idea in mind that these have to agree somehow. And it wasn't until I was a sophomore in college, actually had Hugh Ross came and spoke at Iowa State. I was involved in Campus Crusade. It's called Cru now. Was involved in that, and they invited Hugh Ross to come in, gave some lectures, and I got a chance to talk with him. And I asked him that question, and his question, as I asked him the question, his answer has just resonated. Not because he answered my question, but because he gave me a tool that has been so valuable in my pursuit since then. So I said, Bible says this, science seems to say this. How do you reconcile this? How do you say that works? And he goes, when you look at scripture there are Christians who hold the Bible in high regard, who say those are 24-hour days. The earth is a few thousand years old. But there are other Christians who hold the Bible in equally high regard, who say that those are meant to be much longer periods of time. And what I realized, the conflict I was experiencing was not God's revelation in Scripture. It was in contradiction to God's revelation in creation. The conflict is that I was only looking at part of what Christians who hold Scripture in high regard have looked at and said about Christianity and what those days were. And when I realized that Christians look at those days and say, oh, they could be much longer periods of time or ought to be much longer periods of time, that tension between the revelation. That was a tension in interpretation, not a tension in the revelation themselves. And that was just a key critical understanding, recognition in my part. It was a recognition that if there's this tension or this conflict, that means I don't have all the data. I need to go learn more, because if God is who he says he is, his revelations will never be in conflict with one another.